It's good day to brew, baby. What is up, YouTube? It's your boy, Millsy. Back at Hometown Commander, back for another episode of Millsy Brews, the show where I brew version 1.0 deck lists the commander in front of us in my quest to brew the magic world. You know the motto, baby. It's ABB, always be brewing, and that's what we're back to do today. The deck list is going to be down in the description for you below, as well as I'd really appreciate it if you could interact with the video, like, comment, subscribe, do all that YouTube stuff. I'd appreciate it. But for today, for Teamer Week, I wanted to throw in a non-Tarkir commander or two, just for the fun of it, to keep the theme of the week. And today we're going to talk about Omnath, Locus of the Roil. A 4-mana Teamer elemental. It says when it enters, we're going to deal damage to any target equal to the number of elementals we control. And it's big line of text. Whenever a land comes into our control, we get to put a counter on an elemental we control. If we control 8 or more lands, we draw a card. There's a lot of ways you could care about Omnath. Of course, a lot of the elementals in Magic do have some degree to care about Landfall, and so that'll be nice, allowing to use those effects. But we're also going to play non-elemental creatures that make tokens or other value on Landfall. That's going to be our big thing. And there's two ways we can look at that. We can find ways to play multiple lands per turn, allowing us to get multiple Landfall effects per turns. Or there's a few ways that we can either bounce or replay lands from our graveyard that we could take advantage of to, again, get multiple land plays for turn. Teamer is a great color combination for getting your creatures hasty, so any of those tokens that we make on our lands coming in are going to be able to get in and attack. And then we'll talk about a couple shells for a combo or two that you can look out for if that's something you're interested in looking out for. But I want to thank the channel members. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. If you're interested in seeing all of our videos just a little bit early, check out that link under the video below. But all right, as far as the elemental selection goes, there's a lot of different elementals, and I think some of the best ones just care about lands in general. Ancient and Green Warden lets us play lands from our graveyard, and then if a land coming in would trigger an ability, it goes off twice. This is a great ability for so many things in our deck, but also at minimum for our commander. And it's just not a bad body for its stats and what it's trying to do for us. Ashaya Soul of the Wild got that pretty new secret lair art, but it has an interesting ability. It turns all of our non-token creatures into forest lands instead of the other types, which is a really interesting ability, meaning any non-token creature we play is going to be a land, and then it's scaled for the number of lands we control. Them being lands is a really interesting designation. It can protect them from some sort of removal, right? If your opponent's playing popular removal spells that only hit non-land permanents, that's going to protect our creatures from that. But just in general, that means that any creature that's coming in is going to trigger Landfall. Fertilid's a very interesting creature. For 3 mana, you get a 2/2, a 0/0 with 2/2 ++1 counters on it. And then for 2 mana, you can remove a counter from it to go get a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped. This is a really cool ability because remember, Omnath puts counters on creatures when lands come in, meaning that Fertilid could be a reusable source to go get basic lands for us. Flamekin Harbinger is an elemental that says when it comes in, we can search our library for an elemental and put it on top. There's a lot of nice elementals in the deck. Something like Maelstrom Wanderer beside it if you really want haste for your board, and it comes with Double Cascade. You have things like Risen Reef that care about when it or another elemental comes into our control. And again, there's just a lot of really great elementals you can find in the deck depending on what you need at the current moment in time. And some of those elementals have landfall abilities. You see things like Avenger of Zendikar, which comes in a very classic effect, making a plant for each land you control. Whenever a land comes in, you just put a counter on all your plants, growing yourself a plant army. Greensleeves is one in a line of many landfall creatures that whenever a land comes in, you make a token, and then Greensleeve actually grows for each land you control, which is another great source for that. Lotus Cobra is one of our landfall outlets that makes us a mana. Whenever a land comes in, we get to add a mana of any color. This is really nice, especially for a land that we'll talk about later that can bounce itself back to our hand and play again, right? That mana can be used for that. Mossborn Hydra can become a big threat. Whenever a land comes in, you just double the number of creatures on it, tokens on it. Counters on it, and it always starts with 1, which is really nice. So you could just start doubling it, right? Having it become a real threat. Omnath's just going to make us a 5/5 elemental whenever a land comes in, a nice big threat, and then whenever it or another elemental dies, it deals 3 damage to a target. Not bad to ping out the damage, but I think we really like those 5/5s, especially if we can give them haste. Phylath comes in and makes a plant for each basic land you control. So, right, a little bit different than Avenger of Zendikar, And then whenever a land comes in, you can put 4 counters on a plant you control. So instead of Zendikar, which is spreading them wide, Phylath is going to make them a little bit taller, which is a nice option beside it. Rampaging Balos and Scootsworm are not elementals, but they both have really nice landfall abilities. Balos making a 4/4 beast every time. And then Scootsworm is going to make an insect. Unless you have 6 or more lands, then it just makes a copy of itself, just doubling and doubling and making it bigger and bigger. Roil Elemental is a really interesting ability. Whenever a land comes in, we can just gain control of a creature for as long as we control Roil Elemental. It's a very interesting ability, right? Because you could steal commanders if that's what you want to do. But stealing creatures is a very interesting thing, depending on what your opponents are playing and what they might have access to. And maybe one of your opponent's creatures can really help us in the process. Teddiova can help us dig through our deck, gaining a life and drawing a card whenever a land comes in. Korahome is a interesting way to either tap or untap a creature. If we have creatures that tap to do something, this is really nice, right? Allowing us to get the abilities again, but what's also nice is just tapping down our opponent's creatures. Maybe we can tap down their blockers and get in for better damage. And then Zendikar's Roil just makes us a 2/2 elemental whenever a land comes in. You can sort of see this spread, right, of landfall abilities. Well, there's plenty of cards in our colors that can allow us to play an additional land on each of our turns. Here we see Dryad, Druid class, and Exploration all doing that for us. Some of them pack on a little bit better value, like Elysian Grove makes all of our lands into every basic land type. This could be useful if we have abilities that like care about forests, right, or things like that. But I think the ability to play an additional one is important because they will stack. So if I had 2 of them on the battlefield at the same time, I could play 3 lands that turn. And then you have a chance to just get better value as you go. And I think the best way you have better value to make this really work is with things that can return lands back to our hand. So Living Twister does it. You can pay green to return a tap land you control to its owner's hands. Remember, lands can tap for mana on the turn they come in, right? So if you had a basic forest, you could tap it for a green, return it back to your hand, and then play it back down and do this over and over again, right? Farming those landfall drops as we either draw cards with Omnath or just put on counters. Trade Routes lets you just return a target land you control to its owner's hand for 1 mana. So again, bounce your land, put it back down. And then Buckleberry Fairy or Aboro Palace in the Clouds actually just does it on its own. You tap it for a blue mana, pay 1 to bring it back to its hand, and now, you get to pay for its effect by itself. And again, a nice land that you could play over and over and over again, farming those landfall abilities on our turn. And it's good that we could farm those landfall abilities on our turn because we want to give our creatures haste. Of the 3 of these cards, Rhythm of the Wild is the only one that won't be able to give our tokens haste. It only gives non-token creatures either a counter or haste. But Temur Ascendancy and the new Frostcliff Siege are going to be able to both give all of our creatures haste, meaning that all those landfall tokens, all those tokens we make off landfall are going to have haste, be able to get in into attack. Temur Ascendancy does add a little bit more card draw. Note there were a couple of those landfall triggers we talked about, like Rampaging Balos and Omnath, that'll actually draw us cards off of Temur Ascendancy. So that's kind of interesting. Also, I like that Frostcliff Siege also gives Trample, a nice ability to make sure that if your 4/4s and 5/5s are attacking into 1/1s, right, they're still going to get damage through to our opponents. There's a lot of ways to build combos in a deck like this. There's a lot of ways to just stack your abilities. But I think a fun way to look at this is actually two combinations of these combos, and each of them, the slots of these are normally actually pretty ambiguous. So Kadama's of the East Tree is the key one for both of these combos we're going to talk about. Its ability says whenever a permanent we control enters, if it wasn't put on the battlefield with this ability, you could put a permanent with equal or lesser mana value from your hand onto the battlefield. How this works with Tireless Provisioner specifically is that whenever a land we control enters, we can make a food or treasure token. Note that both of those are permanents with 0 mana value. What also has 0 mana value? Lands. And if we can find a way to always have a land in our hand when those treasures comes in, we can actually loop this. So the way this loop is going to work is you're going to have Kadama and Provisioner both out. You're going to play the Simic Growth Chamber. Note, we also have Gruul Turf and Izzet Boilerworks in this deck. All 3 of those are bounce lands. Any of the 3 of those work. When they enter, they return a land we control to its owner's hand. We're going to bounce the Growth Chamber back to our hand. Provisioner is going to go off, making us a treasure, which is now an untapped land source, and allows us to put Growth Chamber back down again for free. That starts this loop over. Now, you could do this loop as many times as you want to because it's not undeterministic. You don't have to bounce Growth Chamber back to its hand, and you don't have to put something down when you make down the treasure, meaning that we could have this loop go as many times as we want to do it, netting a ton of treasures and, truthfully, just a ton of mana. Now, if you have any other landfall abilities out, we're now just generating that, and that's what we look at here for creatures. We could do this exact same thing. Remember that any creature token you make is a permanent with 0 mana value that you can then do this with to make a arbitrarily large amount of tokens. Now, Scootsworm isn't the only one here, right? We can use any of those landfall abilities that make tokens to do this, generating a ton of them. And since we have haste enablers, that means that we could potentially make all of those tokens hasty and get in for combat. I think in general, our deck wants to make these tokens with landfall and leverage them for our advantage. But it's interesting that we have ways to make an arbitrarily large amount of them or mana to do things to either, play our spells, draw through our decks, things like that. I will note that with this structure of a combo where you're playing these lands over and over again, you need to be careful how you're sculpting your battlefield when you do this. Let's say, for example, I have a Tadiova down as well that's drawing me a card every time I do this. I'm going to start drawing a ton of cards that I don't want to draw, right? Unless that's what I want to do. And so, you just got to be careful what you put in around this combo because every landfall trigger is going to go off twice, for this loop, and you need to make sure that you're not hurting yourself. The difference between something like Lotus Cobra and Tireless Provisioner in this combo is that Lotus Cobra actually doesn't make a token, so it's not going to trigger Kodama like the Provisioner is going to. But if you had Cobra on the battlefield as well, now you're netting 4 mana for each of these loops, right? 2 treasures and 2 mana, and now you're just in great shape, right? Just continuing to add mana to your mana pool as you need to pay for the things you need to pay for. But I've said it before on the show, and I'll say it again. No deck's ever complete. This is my version 1.0 shot at Omnath, and I think in testing, I would look to see, is this combo idea the thing I care about? Do we want to find ways to find it? The answer is probably no, especially in bracket 3, but there's some interesting ways we could pay it off, which is Impact Tremors. I worked really hard to get Impact Tremors into the deck because I think it makes sense, right? You're making these landfall tokens when these lands are coming in potentially 2, 3, 4 at a time. I feel like an ability like Impact Tremors could become important, especially if you want to lean hard into the landfall triggers that make tokens. If so, I think Impact Tremors comes really easily in, and I'm sure we can find a slot for it. I was looking at another card that can find lands like Open the Way. So you could pay 6 into this and go from the top until you hit 4 lands and put them in the battlefield tap. Just a way to get a bunch of lands at once, for a bunch of triggers. And then Raise the Palisades, just a really nice one-sided board wipe, returning all non-elementals back to their owner's hands. I just couldn't find a slot for the Palisade, at least in the list I had together, but I think there's a lot of ways, you can look to that. You also have the option, if you want to go up to something like Bracket 4, to play, things like Cyclonic Rifts, add more game changers and things like that. But I think our deck's doing pretty well at what it wants to anyway. And at a certain point in the game, we're probably just going to have more mana than our opponents to leverage, right, to do what we want to do. Let's get into our playtest. Remember, the goal of playtest on our channel is not to find a magical Christmas land. It's not to show off our best plays, but it's to walk through some game scenarios and see how we could accomplish the things our deck wants to do. Here, we're keeping a 4-lander with Nature's Lore, so a little bit way to ramp. We got some removal, and then Omnath. So we could definitely start working our way up, right? I think we want to ramp early. Right, we really want to get something like Green Sleeves or Omnath down before we start trying to do too much of our, our shenanigans. So I don't mind the idea of do we like Nature's Lore now? Just try to wait to get a little bit more mana down before we play lands like Gruul Turf or Evolving Wilds that can get us, Evolving Wilds that can get us potentially multiple land drop triggers, right? If I bounce the Ketria Triumph to the Gruul Turf, I can have Green Sleeves down next turn, right? But I still have to have a land drop to do it. Or I could, because my thought there is pick up the Forest, put down the Gruul Turf. We could still tap it for mana if we wanted to, but now there is 4 mana. Next turn will be 5, and we can play Green Sleeves. The only problem with that route is then We're waiting another turn to play Omnath. Is Omnath worth getting down early just to start growing counters on it? I mean, that's, I guess, the question for y'all. But at least at the moment, I do have 2 untapped lands that could come in. So my thought was maybe something like Omnath. It would deal out 1 damage, which isn't top tier, but it is still damage that could be dealt out. And then here on our next turn, now I'm thinking something like Green Sleeves, or sorry, the Soft Falls, put a counter there. Now play the Green Sleeves, so Green Sleeves could start making us those Badgers on turns coming forward. Oh, now there's Kadama's Reach. So we've got this loop, right, almost ready to go here. We just need to deploy all our pieces. My thought now is get another piece down. The problem with going for Kadama right now is I have no way to play another land. Right? I could go Evolving Wilds this turn if I wanted to. This would get me a counter here and then a Badger, right? And then sack the Wilds to go get, I think a red source is probably what we want. Looks like the way to just even out our colors a little bit. Right? Make another Badger, and then now, because that is it's 8 lands, so only 6 lands, but now, these both are growing. That can attack this turn, right? And now we're setting up next turn for, Green Sleeves came in this turn. We could start setting up for this Kadama as early as next turn. The only problem is we just don't have any way to give those, well, there we go. There's our way to give them haste in something like Maelstrom Wanderer. So 6 mana, we could get Kadama's Reach down. It just doesn't get us to that last land we need for that. But we could, we could Fairy and then Omnath and set up for next turn. Or my thought was we could Kadama. 6. My thought was we could play Gruul Turf, which would bounce a mountain back to our hand, but we could put a land down with Kadama. Now we're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So now we're perfect for Maelstrom Wanderer next turn. That would trigger a couple more landfall triggers. And now next turn when we play, sorry. We would need to bounce, I apologize. We would bounce Gruul Turf back with the ability, and then put the Buckleberry Fairy down, which is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but that doesn't get us there. Why was I thinking this was going to work? This is just 7. I need the 8 to get the Wanderer down. So maybe that doesn't... I'm trying to work this way through this combo in my head, right? Maybe it makes more sense to... So this is where we started, right? If I do this, bounce itself back, I could still put the Buckleberry down with Kadama, right? That gives me 7. I could play Omnath, right? And then now it sets me up potentially for this turn. Well, there's the Rootbound Crag. I guess I could get the process started, right? I could Gruul Turf, bounce itself back, put the Rootbound Crag in. We'll get a couple Badgers and a couple Elementals. Then use all the mana to play the Maelstrom Wanderer. And I think all we need to do is get into something that can let us play multiple lands per turn, and then I think we're golden. Those would have both been our 8th land, so we would have drawn 2 cards, right? And then spread a couple more counters out. And then the Wanderer can cascade twice. I mean, again, all we need to is to hit something that can allow us to play a second land this turn, and we're golden. Otherwise, all these things can just start attacking. Well, let's just see what it would hit. The Provisioner, well, that helps us with getting the mana set up. Growth Spiral. And there we go. That can now start our loop, right? Because that allows us to put a land from our hand on the battlefield. That's when we put the turf down, right? Now we're netting the treasure and the tokens, right? We kind of get the best of both worlds. And again, bounce it back to our hand, make the treasure or the land. Either way, we're either the creature token, then we're putting Gruul Turf back down, bounce it back. And now we can just do this as many times as we want. Load up on elementals and badgers, load up on treasures for That, and we're golden, and this is the 8th land, so this is actually just drawing us through cards, right, through Omnath, right? This is putting counters in, it's drawing us through cards. We could find counter spells to protect ourselves, right? We could find so many things, and so this isn't that hard to get yourself into. Yes, it requires a couple key pieces, but I just think that goes to show you that it's a little more attainable than you may think. Here, we'll get into playtest number 2, keeping a 4-lander with a Shia, Risen Reef. Invasion of Zendikar, one of our battles, when it comes in, we go get 2 basic lands on the battlefield tapped, and then when we flip it to the backside, it is a elemental that can tap for a mana. But it's also a land, so not bad, right? It could be pretty useful for us. Turn 1, we see Exploration, which is kind of nice, although if I do this, explore, and then do this, I was going to say, I was trying to hope for like a turn 3 Risen Reef, but that doesn't get me there unless I go like this and I crack the Expanse for a blue, right? Then that would get me to Risen Reef on turn 2. Because Risen Reef's a nice source of value. Because both the Root Round Clag, both the Rockfall Veil and the Cinderglade come in untapped here. We could Risen Reef, remember whenever another elemental comes in, look at the top card of our library. If it's a land, put it on the battlefield. If we don't put it into our hand, battlefield, put it into our hand. And we don't have to do the second land drop, but I feel like we probably need to. Just to set up, I would think Omnath, and that's almost perfect, right? Because now we can Omnath. It comes in dealing 2 to somebody. Risen Reef goes off. It's a land. We put it into the battlefield tapped. Thinking counter on Omnath, right? And then we get our land for turn, which is Fabled Passage. That could put a counter there. And then crack the passage, right? And thinking maybe a red source here just to make sure we're evening out. You know, put a counter here. So now we're getting... That was our first land drop, right? We can't crack that Devolving Wilds because it came in tapped. And now, right, we could start playing things like Druid Class, which can get us another land drop. Zendikar, which could go get us a couple lands and get them in. Ashaya could start making all of our creatures into lands. Crucible of Worlds lets us play lands back out of our graveyards. We could start playing like Fabled Passage and Evolving Wilds back out of our graveyard. If I go for Zendikar this turn, I get to go get the 2 lands, right? Now remember that... Omnath checks, and these 2 come in at the same time, which I do believe would have Omnath go off twice and draw us 2. And then we could still crack the Evolving Wilds this turn. The land it gets is going to come in tapped. I honestly don't think we mind. Because it would just get us another draw, right? And then... another counter, another draw. All these guys came in tapped, so there's another way we can do that. But we do have another land drop, right? Because of the Exploration. We get something like Reliquary Tower in, another counter, draw a card. And although we don't have any mana left this turn, we could potentially attack this Zendikar. Let's say for the purposes of this that we have, and we give it to the person who doesn't have any blockers, and we attack it, and it flips over. Another counter, draw, right? Because this is now a land, right? Because of its ability. And if we had to play for 1 mana, we could take it, but we don't. And now as we get into our next turn, you know, we've got multiple land drops. We could start playing things like Evolving Wild, Terramorphic Expanse, and Fabled Passage out of our graveyard, remember? Because we could play lands out of the graveyard with this Conduit of Worlds if we want to. Ashaya could be fun this turn because it would count as a land, and a follow-up play like a Scoot Swarm or a Dryad would count as a land, right? Giving us draws and then setting us up for more land plays. Like, my thought is Ashaya for 5, which counts as a land, so counter, draw a card, right? We've got 4 mana left, and we got 1 more land play we can make. Or 2 more land plays, sorry, because we haven't played a land. But you could get something like Scoot Swarm in, if you want, or, well, we have to get the Conduit right, because we got to get, we got to get the lands back out of our graveyard, right? If that's the route we want to go. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have like 1 mana left. Oh, sorry, but these are all forests. So we would have 4 mana. We could get like Scoot Swarm down, right? Which would be another land drop. Draw us a card. Is one of our real land drops, right? Land draws a card, and now we could start playing we could play the lands out of our graveyard and sack them, getting double each time, right? Just funding this, and look, now we're seeing thing like Kadama. The thing I like about something like Kadama is you could play something like Green Warden and put one of these other creatures in for free off its ability. It's just a great thing to help you get multiple permanents down. And now this isn't a really bad board state, especially since now we're making a ton of these insects. Now we're making just copies of Scoot Swarm every time a land comes in because we've got the threshold. And then I guess you could say the last thing we need is a haste enabler. But I mean, at this point, we can just grow our creatures to become threats on the board. Let's get into playtest number creeping a 3-lander with Risen Reef, Ramunap Excavator, which lets us play lands back out of our graveyard. There's the Harbinger, and then a Doppelgang. Doppelgang is a very interesting spell I wanted to try out in here. You make X copies of X target permanents, so it could potentially make copies of lands, creatures. There's a lot of ways you could take that. Here I think it's Cynically turn 1. Mr. Eyes, right, one of our new lands that you could stop a spell from being prevented, or stop a spell from being countered. I don't mind the Druid class here. I guess you could also play the Harbinger and go dig for an elemental of your choice, but I kind of want to see this board develop before I really truly like go too deep. I'm thinking Risen Reef here. It's Cabaret Courtyard, which is going to automatically sacrifice itself, and when it does, we get to go get another land, either a forest or a mountain here because of its colors. I think I'll go get the mountain. Kind of unfortunate we didn't have another landfall trigger in besides this Druid's class that's just gaining us a life, but that's okay. I mean, it just builds up more mana for our next turn. Now I'm thinking Omnath. I was going to say we could play the forest before it, I guess, if we want to also get the Harbinger in this turn, but that's going to trigger Risen Reef. Counter, right, also gain a life, and then that's just 1 green mana, so there's nothing we can do with it yet. Again, would have loved to have had... I guess I could have played the forest first and then also gotten the Harbinger in this turn, and then we could have gone and got one of our, landfall creature, enablers, right? Here we see Zuran Orb. This is a way to get lands into your graveyard by sacrificing them to gain life, which then you can use, right, things like Ramunap Excavator to play them back out of your graveyard, right? Really taking advantage of those multiple plays. If I go get the Harbinger, what am I looking for? Probably just any of our elementals that make tokens, because it has to go get one of those. Or we could Yavimaya counter and then do that invasion play again. We'll go get a blue and a red. And then remember, both of these are going to trigger Omnath, right? A couple counters. Draw us a couple cards. There we see Roil Elemental. Nice way to start stealing things. There's the Core Hum to start knocking things down. And now, we're not in too bad a shape. I do actually believe we still have 2 mana. Oh, that's right. Zuran Orb's free. 2 mana left this turn that we could use, but I don't see anything to use it for. Now we're building our board state. We're getting ourselves involved. I think we're just a couple turns away from just being able to print some really big value. Remember that Doppelgang can copy lands. I mean, there could be a fun way where we could put something like Roil Elemental down and potentially just take up on a ton of our opponent's creatures, right? We know that any land we put in draws us a card, so we could technically play Flamekin Harbinger, right, and go get an elemental of our choice. I kind of feel like this could be a good board state for Avenger of Zendikar, but I kind of feel like it's just the Wanderer, right? Because we kind of want to start setting up some hay shenanigans. Now I could put down the Expanse, drawing me the card, right? Putting a counter out there. It's only 8 with the Expanse, and the Expanse, right, puts a land in the battlefield tap. So we could do something like Roil and then sack the Terramorphic Expanse to go searching, get a land, counter, draw a card, steal something. Maybe we try to flip this turn. getting another land counter, draw a card. And now on our next turn, now this is the turn where maybe we go for the Wanderer. 8 mana, we get to get the double Cascade. There's Fertilid and a Farseek. Farseek can go get us. The type of land won't particularly matter here. We'll just go get a basic forest again. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of the game, but that, again, triggers, draws you a card, takes something. And I think next turn we could just go for like a massive doppelgang, right? We would just want to find... I was trying to think of some way to make tokens, right? Because that's the only thing we don't have right now is something to make tokens like green sleeves. I think that would be the logical next step, to get green sleeves in. I mean, we could have just as easily hit it off of Maelstrom Wanderer. That's what I was trying to do, was try to hit something with it. But I think green sleeves could do it too, especially now with the haste. And then something like Doppelgang, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We have 10 mana, which is what? 2 in each X, but we could easily play that Allura and make it 3 in each X, making 3 copies of each of 3 lands, 9 landfall drops, and just to create a ton of value in a turn would be what I was, kind of thinking of there. But I'd love to know, what do you think of Omnath down in the comment section below? Again, I think there's a nice shell here, of course, taking advantage of those land drops. As much as I like 4-color Omnath, there's a lot more brokenness and expectation with that Omnath, whereas I think this Omnath is a ton of fun. It lets you play some interesting options, and you still have some combos if that's what you're looking for. But let me know what you think of Omnath, and I'll catch you in the next one.